Good afternoon to everyone joining us today, and good morning to our audience across the Atlantic. I am Juxhina Gjoni, the President of Youth Atlantic Treaty Association. On behalf of the next series of the Atlantic Treaty Association talk, it is my pleasure to welcome and thank you all for joining us in such an interesting webinar with our special guest, General Sir Nick Carter. Recognizing the increasingly complex security environment, our topic of today's webinar is defense in an era of strategic competition. I take this occasion to also congratulate with the CEO of the Atlantic Treaty Association of the UK, Mr. David Hobbs, for contributing this way in our association's mission, educating and raising awareness to our societies on foreign affairs and security issues that are relevant to our alliance. With us today will be in the panel also the President of the Atlantic Treaty Association, Mr. Jim Townsend, and also the panel, the webinar will be moderated by our Secretary General, Ms. Monika Begovic. Now, without taking so much time, Monika, I will pass on to you.
Thanks a lot, Gina, for your introduction. And indeed, we have a very special guest with us today who will participate in our discussion under the topic Defense in an Era of Strategic Competition. When trying to make a short introduction about General Carter, I must say that the most difficult part in this task was making it short. I will be short and long in some parts. General Carter has been a professional head of the United Kingdom's armed forces for more than 3 years. And before that, he was the head of the British Army. He joined the army in 1977, so allow me to mention only a few aspects of his remarkable military career. During the Cold War, he served on the ground in Germany. He also served in Northern Ireland during troubles, in Cyprus with the UN, and in command positions in operations in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Kosovo. He served repeatedly in Iraq and Afghanistan between 2002 and 2013. He has held top policy positions as well as senior command positions, being a key architect of the UK's recent integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy. This has been notable for its fresh thinking about the role of the armed forces in today's era of strategic competition. This subject is of great interest also to the entire NATO community, because NATO itself will need to address the same sort of issues and challenges as it develops its new strategic concept. General Carter has vast experience in the military and has worked in defense and security policy at the very highest level and during a period that has seen critical events and development. We are therefore really privileged to have him as the speaker in today's ATA talks. General Carter, we are looking forward to hearing your presentation to be followed with our discussion moderated discussion afterwards, and we really appreciate you were able to join us today. The floor is yours for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Monika and Gina, thank you for your kind words of introduction. I much look forward to addressing all of you, and I gather it's a very large audience. You might have to bear with me a little bit, as all of our immune systems have been shattered by COVID, and I'm afraid there's a bit of a cough and cold going around the UK at the moment, which unfortunately I've got the tail end of a cough, but I'm sure I will manage to hack it for the next 25 to 30 minutes, but bear with me if there has to be a coughing to one side. It's not COVID, I promise you. But taking your starting point that we're going to talk about defence in an era of strategic competition, I think that I cannot remember a time in my career when the operating environment of the strategic context was more complex or dynamic than it now is. And of course, I grew up in an era when it was relatively straightforward. It was called the Cold War, and it was a bipolar world. And we had a pretty good understanding of what that bipolar world meant to us all, and indeed how we needed to respond to it. Of course, the Cold War came to an end in 1989, and we then found ourselves in this extraordinary world where it was effectively unipolar, with one significant superpower and not much else. And of course, we then entered into a period of sort of benign intervention and that sort of thing. And then, of course, terrorism post 9/11 and all that that meant. Now, we've emerged in a way from our initial response to terrorism, I hasten, not from terrorism, into a world now which is, of course, no longer unipolar. It's now increasingly multipolar. And that is a very unusual place for our generation to now find ourselves. And I think you probably have to go back to the 1930s or 1940s to be clear about what that means. And therefore, we're having to learn from the beginning all over again as to how we're going to manage to play the multi-dimensional game of checkers that is necessary at the strategic level to be genuinely competitive in that very different competitive environment. Now, that has an impact on all sorts of things, not least our approach to deterrence. And the UK's response to this has been to produce a new operating concept, what we call our integrated operating concept. And that is something that we've been developing, I suppose, for 4 or 5 years now, and it was really only launched properly in September last year. But it absolutely informed the ways in terms of how we were going to approach, from a UK defence perspective and more broadly security perspective, the integrated review of foreign security, defence and development policy that Monika referred to earlier. Now, I'm going to talk to what's in that concept during the course of my remarks, because it's really that which underpins the approach that we believe is relevant to dealing with defence in an era of strategic competition. Now, our starting point for why we needed a new operating concept was because we believed that we were now increasingly up against what I would call assertive authoritarian rivals. And I'm being careful here not to describe them necessarily as enemies, because I would always say that Russia is probably our acute threat, but China is much more of a systemic challenge than a threat. And that perhaps is an important distinction that we need to make. But of course, these assertive authoritarian rivals, they see the strategic context as a continuous struggle where all of the instruments of statecraft, both military and non-military, are essentially used unconstrained by any distinction between peace and war, as we in the West would probably define those terms. What they're trying to do is to achieve their objectives without going to war, and certainly below the threshold of what would prompt a warfighting response from ourselves and our allies. And they do that essentially through fait accompli strategies. And we've seen that, of course, in the Crimea, we've seen it in Georgia, we see it in the South China Sea, and you will think of many other examples where that is the case. Now, it's not just state actors that behave like this. We also see it, of course, with non-state actors who are also using what they can below the threshold of what might prompt a warfighting response to achieve their objectives as well. But here I'm much more focused on interstate activity. Now, of course, they're able to do this in a way that they do because, of course, over the last 20 or 30 years, the character of warfare, and for that matter, the character of politics, has evolved significantly. And I'm not talking here about the nature of war, which never changes. That's always visceral, it's always violent, it's always about the interaction in political terms between peoples. I'm talking here about the character of it. And that, of course, is predominantly because of the pervasiveness of information. And it's also about rapid technological change. And I often say that I think we're living in a period of change now, which is more profound than we've probably encountered in all of the last century, and certainly the last 2 world wars combined. And of course, what is challenging for us is that the pace is ever quickening. Now, this changing character of warfare has made it possible, I think, for the distinctions that we've traditionally held between peace and war, between foreign and domestic policy, between state and non-state, and between virtual and reality to be blurred, and they've become less distinct. Now, that is therefore, on top of all that, our opponents, rivals, call it what they may, have now got a lot of new tools, tactics and techniques that they can use to achieve their objectives in these grey areas between those formally clear distinctions. And we see that with missile technology. We see it with what Russia is doing, particularly in undersea warfare capability. You see it in EW, cyber. drone, robotics, space, and of course with CBRN. And of course, what we also see is that they are very happy to go back to the future and use proxies to achieve their objectives. And we see that particularly with Russia and the so-called private military security company, or I think it'd be more appropriate to call it a militia, that is Wagner, who are operating in probably 34 or 5 different countries now on many different continents. And of course, we're hearing about them perhaps taking part in activity in Mali now. So they are spreading their wings. And of course, the advantage of proxies like this is that they can be used to achieve your objectives in a deniable way. And it's very difficult for us to provide attribution all the way back to the government that might be using them. So this notion of plausible deniability is very useful if you're trying to achieve your objectives short of bringing on a warfighting response. Now, all of this, I think, tells us that we need a new concept for deterrence. Now, traditionally, we have always thought about deterrence on the basis of 4 C's. The C's of capability and credibility, and then the C of communication and the C of comprehension. We are now arguing in our integrated operating concept that in this new environment, we need a 5th C, and that is the C of competition. Because of course, we can't any longer think on the basis that deterrence is essentially a passive activity, whereby you communicate your credibility and your capability, having understood the effect it might have through comprehension on your rival or opponent, or even your ally for that matter. Now you need to be actually, in an active sense, competing to avoid them filling strategic vacuums and achieving their objectives without bringing on the warfighting response. I think the analogy that's often used is the analogy of a boiling frog. If you put a frog into cold water and turn on the heat, you'll probably surprise it, but if you throw it into hot water, it'll leap out immediately. And it's that fact that we are being boiled like that frog which we need to avoid. And we need to avoid the vacuums that increasingly we have created as a result of our commitment to the counter-terror campaign that we've been waging perhaps for the last 20 years. Now, what we also need to recognize in this sense of competition is that, one more point to make about comprehension. What we need to recognize, I think, with comprehension is I don't think we're very good at it. I don't think we have a very clear understanding of the effect that we are achieving on our potential opponents and indeed our rivals. And that, I think, is because most of our effort in terms of the journey we've been on from the Cold War onwards has not necessarily been focused on understanding the rivals that we now have in this great power competition that we're now involved in. And we have to become smarter about that aspect of comprehension. Now, go back to competition. On top of competition, I think we also need to recognize that in modern deterrence, we need to become cleverer at escalation management. And at the moment, I think we run significant risks in NATO that we are not as well able to manage escalation management in the way that some of our opponents are, particularly Russia. And a lot of this comes back to where they've invested in technological terms over the last 10 to 15 years. I also think that we need to recognize that escalation management is no longer up a single ladder. It's actually much more now about a spider's web, because it's multiple ladders that you need to escalate and de-escalate up and down. And whether that's the new domains of cyber and space that have added to this, or whether it's the information space or whatever else it is, we need to recognize that this is a much more complex business than it perhaps was during the course of the Cold War. So I think that, in a sense, sets up why we feel we need this new integrated operating concept and how we are trying to realize it through the changes and adjustments we're making to culture, to posture, and to our force structure and capability. Now, of course, right at the heart of this, and that is why it is called an integrated operating concept, is this word integration. I think we're increasingly of the opinion that this word may well replace jointery. We used to talk about jointery on the basis of the working together of maritime, air and land, and we used to talk about it predominantly being at the operational level. What I think we're now suggesting is that actually integration is much bigger than that. And it needs to, first and foremost, deal with all of the levers of statecraft, because if you're going to achieve the sorts of effects you need to achieve in the world that we've described, it's the military instrument is invariably going to be the last instrument you need. The first instrument you will need will be all the other ones. And of course, we're learning that in much of the training and exercising that we're doing at the moment. And in our Joint Expeditionary Force, which is this group we've pulled together of the Baltic states, the Nordic states, and the Netherlands during the course of the last 3 or 4 years, we're increasingly thinking about how we will develop our thinking. And we ran a tabletop exercise this year where the sort of scenario that our ministers were required to get their minds around were fundamentally scenarios which were obviously below the threshold of war, but which actually required less of the military input and much more of the broader statecraft that's necessary to achieve effect. Now, how you get that culture to change in Western democracies is a big question which we might want to come back to, but it's fundamentally the question that we're going to need to answer if we're able to deal with the authoritarian rivals that we're up against. Now, of course, the next bit that needs to be integrated fundamentally are your words and your deeds. And again, this is very challenging, depending on whether you look at it in a NATO context or, for that matter, in a Western democratic context. You know, in a NATO context, we've always distinguished very clearly between what we call crisis and conflict and what happens short of crisis. And of course, crisis is that tipping point when Article 5 might be relevant to what you're doing. And of course, you begin to think about all of the political instruments that NATO can use. But short of that, it's much more complicated. And we're most unlikely to get into a position where we are prepared to give SACA the authorities to be able to do anything obviously active short of crisis. It's going to be a much more collaborative approach in political terms at the moment. The next bit that needs to be integrated are your operational domains. And of course, here we're not just talking about maritime, land and air, we're now talking about cyber and space, 5 operational domains. Because of course, we recognize that the total effect will add up to much more than the sum of the parts. And this brings back to the definition of jointery, because of course, what we also recognize is that integration is not going to just happen at the operational strategic levels. Increasingly, it's going to need to happen at the tactical level. And that has major impacts upon how you train and educate people to be able to avail themselves of those sorts of effects from those sorts of domains to achieve the outcome. And I think it's a term that people are beginning to use is something like expanded maneuver. The next bit of integration that's fundamental to this is how you integrate with allies. And of course, we absolutely start from the principle that you are not going to warfight other than with allies. So how you integrate with allies for all range of reasons, but particularly below the threshold of war, is very fundamental to the way that we are thinking. Now, NATO is moving and has moved a long way since 2015, and indeed probably even since 2018, with its new NATO military strategy, its new concept for the defence and deterrence of the European area, and then SACA's strategic plan, his strategic directive, and the work that's now going on for the subordinate plans below all of that. But at the heart of that, there are some big questions that need to be resolved. The first question is how you end up with more of a continuum into crisis and conflict from competition. There's a big question, I think, which needs to be answered on how you match the idea of 360 to what that means to what NATO should be doing in NATO's depth, perhaps in Africa, but also in the Middle East, and in terms of countries like Ukraine and how that plays into it all. And of course, there is the whole business of how you align increasingly force structure, which may not be ideal for the new operating context I've described, in a way that encourages nations to modernize that force structure to make it relevant for the future. So integration, really fundamental to us. The next point I'd like to come back to is this idea of competition and how we are translating through this concept a distinction between warfighting and operating. Now, we do this because we would say that warfighting is what cuts in once you hit that threshold of war. Now, of course, being able to warfight and being able to do that with allies is fundamental to the capability and credibility that you need to do everything short of war. And we are calling what you do short of war operating. Now, the ingredients to operating from our perspective are first and foremost protecting, and that is about protecting your critical national infrastructure. And that will be things from your ability to be able to maneuver your submarines, to being able to protect the cross Atlantic cables that are so fundamental to everything we espouse, to your ability to be able to operate from your Air Force bases, from your dockyards, or to be able to mobilize your military or your army to go and do what it does. So everything associated with that, and that's fundamentally about resilience and readiness. And that is the action of protecting. The second one is what we would call engaging or engage. And that is first and foremost about partners and allies and our interaction with them in order to make us more effective. And of course, it's also about how we can think about utilizing what we do in relation to counter-violent extremism, or indeed UN peacekeeping, to be able to build capacity of partners to avoid strategic vacuums that could be filled by your rivals like Russia or China. And therefore, engagement is a broad term which covers all of the sort of angle of partners, allies, but also the more nuanced approach in relation to international institutions. And then the third ingredient of what we call operate is what we call constrain. And constrain is particularly about the new domains of cyber and space. And it is obviously about trying to prevent your opponents, your rivals, from filling vacuums and achieving advantage below that threshold of war. And of course, it's about trying to avoid and calling out where they're trying to go with plausible deniability and everything associated with that. Now, in all of that operate effects that we're talking about, what is really important is recognizing the importance of military soft power in all of this. Now, one of the initiatives that I have pursued in this job over the last 3.5 years or so is to try and re-engage in military soft power terms with, for example, our Caribbean opposite numbers and the Anglophile countries there, but equally in the Gulf and more broadly in the Middle East. Because what, of course, they are looking for, and that is often the case from Western countries, is they're looking for training education, and they're looking for some of the well-known brands that countries have, in particular in our case, things like the Royal Naval College at Dartmouth, or for that matter, the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. And what they want is they want obviously places in those colleges for their young to be developed, but knowing full well that they can't get them for everybody, they are much looking forward to those sorts of facilities being created in their environments so that they are able to develop in the way that we have developed. And the utilization of that military soft power and everything that it brings with it, I think is absolutely fundamental to this notion of engagement that I talked about a moment ago. And I would just stress again that military soft power and the ability to operate has to be underpinned by the capacity and capability to warfight, because otherwise people won't want you, because they won't believe that you ultimately can do what's necessary to do. Now, the other angle in terms of our integrated operating concept is essentially to use it as a catalyst to modernize. And of course, it's trite to say it, but we need to move from where we are now, more or less in an industrial age of platforms, increasingly to an information age of systems. And as part of that, this integrated operating concept will morph into a future operating concept, which will get after, I think, what the future of warfare looks like. And that is going to be about a competition between hiding and finding. And we're already beginning to see that, aren't we? We saw it a bit in the Donbass, we've seen it in Syria, and of course we saw it last year in the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And coming to terms with how you manage the conflict between hiding and finding is going to be fundamentally at the heart of what we do. And inside our integrated operating concept, we list a series of deductions one might draw from that about what future capabilities might need to look like. And those sorts of characteristics are fundamentally going to be about having smaller and faster platforms. It's going to be about reducing probably physical protection for increased mobility. It's going to be about low observable and stealth technologies. It's going to be a mix of probably crewed and uncrewed platforms and autonomous platforms. But fundamentally, it's going to be about being more integrated into ever more sophisticated networks of systems. So that the analogy of the iPhone is alive and well on the battlefield of the future. And things must have open systems architectures if you're going to succeed. Now, in order to try and make that happen in our armed forces, in a rather sort of unreasonable way, we've described capabilities as sunset capabilities and sunrise capabilities. And that is a mechanism to try and drive change. And a lot of what has fallen out of our integrated review and the Defence Command paper that supports it is the sunsetting of certain capabilities to create the headroom for the sunrise. The trick, of course, is to find a path through the night. And right at the heart of all of this, therefore, is a return to the lost art of proper experimentation. And doing that experimentation in parallel with much investment in science and technology, and of course, in research and development. And increasingly trying to do that in a way that incentivizes partnerships with the outside world on an enterprise basis, which of course asks big questions about your acquisition and procurement systems and everything associated with how you write requirements and probably overspecify them. And we might want to come back to that if you want in questions. Now, at the heart of all of this, I think the two principles that I would wish to apply are adaptability and agility. And of course, that quickly means that the real emphasis and priority for everything I'm talking about here is about your people, because fundamentally people are at the heart of the ability to have an adaptive edge. And you know, whenever I talk about it, I absolutely put people front and center at what we're talking about. Now, there are some significant challenges with what I've described. We've essentially put this into a concept. Of course, it's not yet doctrine, and we need to evolve it to become doctrine because, of course, it's doctrine what is taught. It has an impact upon our force structure, which we are in the moment transitioning through. There will be a significant balance, I think, in terms of the amount of input we have between a regular force structure and the reserve force structure. And what this allows you to do, because of that distinction between warfighting and operating, is to apply some readiness assumptions to the use of the reserve. We will therefore use the reserve, I think, much more than perhaps we've done in the past, because we believe that's a good way of essentially keeping certain capabilities in the right place, but also being able to mobilize accordingly, recognizing that our opponents don't wish necessarily to go to war. It requires us, I think, to think hard about structures that are able to do training, advising, assisting, and accompanying partnered forces. So going back to my example of counter-violent extremism or UN peacekeeping, you know, I can see us being involved, for example, with an African troop contributing nation and providing them with the train, advise, assist, and then accompanying them on the UN operation and cycling that through to improve our capacity to do peacekeeping, but also their capacity generally to be able to provide for the security of their country. It's asking big questions about how we do command and control, because of course, traditionally we've been organized with a command and control system that deals with operations overseas and then might have to stand up to deal with homeland defense. No longer can you do that because the distinction between the two is now blurred, and you need to be thinking about how you do command and control all the time, both home and away, in an integrated way. And that quickly asks questions about how you do command and control across government, because going back to my point about the other instruments of statecraft being the decisive ones, probably, how do you bring that to bear too? And it also asks profound questions about how we do strategic communications. And of course, the greatest weakness for Western democracies is how they do strategic communications. And how you are prepared to test traditional statecraft in terms of your messaging and the way that you play this. Recognizing, of course, that you're always dealing with multiple audiences. And it's been very evident during the Ides of August, when you wanted to put your head above the parapet to talk about Afghanistan. You know, there were audiences that were going to take offense on certain things and audiences that might understand what you're saying in other areas. Really challenging strategic communication environment at the moment with a 24-hour or even instant news cycle that makes it really difficult for you to be strategic in the way that you're headed, and very difficult for you to deal with your authoritarian rivals who have much tighter control of what they're talking about. But I think, to summarize, I think essentially I see our challenge, and for that matter, probably the challenge of all Western armed forces at the moment, in two parts. The first part is how you establish a strategic culture, posture, and if you like, way of warfare or operating, which is fit for purpose in this era of competition. The strategic culture, that's the first challenge that you've got to establish. And then I think the second challenge, which is unsurprising, I suspect, is how you modernize at the pace of relevance, given the extraordinary pace of change that we have at the moment, And to my mind, those are the two things that I sort of frame my thinking through, is strategic culture and that modernisation. And this integrated operating concept that we launched back in September is designed to try and help us find a way through towards the strategic culture and to the modernising question that we've also got to answer. So I hope that tees up a few thoughts, a few questions, a bit of a discussion, a bit of a debate. Thank you for your attention. And my voice seems to have held out, which is a relief.
Well done. Thank you for staying the course, General. I've been trying desperately to follow all the questions and compliments that are coming in. I can tell you now, we're not going to be able to get to them all. And I'll do my best with Monika to make them all, to address as many as we can, even if it means paraphrasing. Can I start with integration and, if you like, the implementation of the integrated operating concept? And let me preface that by saying I think it's a fantastic approach, and it's gone down extraordinarily well, I know, within the strategic studies community, both nationally and internationally. Let me begin. There was a great headline last year which pointed out, it was in the Times, that Army communication specialists are working to help fight disinformation on vaccinations and the COVID epidemic. This had become, evident that there were international actors really trying to undermine our society in that particular way. Now, in terms of buy-in on the integrated operating concept, in one sense, it's difficult enough to get people to understand this new era of strategic competition. How are you working with, if you like, all the other instruments of statecraft, whether it's the medical community, whether it's even the private sector, to explain to them that they're going to have to be mobilized and work, if you like, on security issues to stop those institutions being undermined? How do you actually relate to all the other tools of statecraft, if you see what I mean? Maybe if we start with that one, and then I'll come back with another one.
Okay, I think COVID is an interesting example, because I think it's much easier to be able to get people to work together if you've got a common understanding of the problem you're trying to solve. And of course, with COVID, it was jolly complicated, and it's a huge challenge, and it still endures. But the reality is that we all sort of knew roughly what we were trying to do together to achieve the effect. And it was becoming apparent that there was an awful lot of misinformation out there, in other words, confusion. And people needed to understand where the confusion was coming from, what social media sites were pushing it, and how all of that was happening. But it was equally clear that there were others who were using disinformation, in other words, a deliberate effort to try and undermine the plan and the scheme that we were all working to across government. And we had produced a capability about 6 or 7 years ago called 77 Brigade, which was designed really for battlefields and for tactical interaction on battlefields. And its task on the battlefield is to maintain or change behaviours using non-violent means. So essentially using development, words, those sorts of things to achieve an effect, and using social media or media to achieve the realisation of their objectives. Now, as a capability, they are available to be used in all sorts of ways, but government felt it was logical to bring them in, not to write messages and push them out, but rather to identify where misinformation was coming from, or what the misinformation was, and ditto with disinformation, so government could then work out what the government's response would be as a whole. But that was relatively straightforward because, of course, we had a common sense of purpose. I think we also understood back in 2018 when the Russians had a go at the Skripal family in Salisbury. We had a common sense of purpose. We knew what we were trying to achieve. It was very easy to marshal a narrative and to be able to get behind it. So I think the starting point is you need a common sense of purpose in order to get people to marshal their thinking behind it. And if you can do that, then I think you can probably achieve the effect, albeit doing it in an agile way at the right tempo is difficult to do, but I think that's possible. I think the problem we have on a daily basis is if we don't necessarily all acknowledge the threat that we're up against, and if we don't understand how that threat is trying to undermine our way of life and our ideology, and we haven't agreed that we've got to do something about it, then we are in a very difficult position. And I think that's more of our problem at the moment, is getting our thinking around what it is that we need to be protecting collectively and what we need to be doing perhaps proactively to be able to achieve a goal or an objective as a government. And I think that's the bit that we've got to work behind.
Thank you very much indeed. Absolutely. I think this notion of almost changing society's mindset, because frankly, we're used to international cooperation far more, and we simply assume that that's the way everybody else thinks. And actually persuading people that, very sadly, not everybody does think that way is an enormous challenge these days. In terms of how this relates internationally, could you just talk a little bit about how you see this feeding into NATO's new strategic concept? And is there a mechanism involved? How is it working that, the conclusions that you've arrived at in the defence review as a whole are being fed into essentially the same exercise that NATO is having to do?
Yes, I mean, it's obviously more challenging to get change to occur amongst 30 nations for obvious reasons. And of course, the 30 nations see the world differently. If you sit close to Russia in the east, you're very clear about what you think the problem set is. If, of course, you sit further west or further south, you're probably more influenced by what you see happening in Africa or maybe the Middle East. So there's the challenge of where you sit and how you therefore view the world. But I don't think anybody in the 30, and here I'm talking about, of course, my interaction with chiefs of defence. I'm not talking about the political level. In my interaction with my military friends, they see the world in exactly the same way that I've described it to you now. They have challenges, of course, delivering their politicians to accept that this might mean that they need to be more proactive below the threshold of war. But in principle, they see the world in exactly the same way. And they are therefore entirely comfortable with the NATO warfighting concept, which is being developed at the moment. They're entirely comfortable with the way that the concept for deterrence and defence is evolving. They would, of course, many of them like to see their regional plan for their particular part of the NATO area developed more quickly than other parts. But in principle, I think they see it the same way. The challenge we have on a daily basis is that, a vast percentage of activity in that Euro-Atlantic area on a daily basis is, of course, not under SACEUR, it's under individual nations. Now, of course, the Russians looking in would assume it's all part of NATO. How you actually bring it together and, make it coherent and coordinated to achieve a common effect is a challenge. And Headquarters SHAPE have got some answers to this. They've created a new sort of effects process group of people who are working out what effect you might be able to impart in terms of deterrence and, for that matter, reassurance. And they're working out how they can use the activity that is programmed forwards or on a daily basis to be able to bring this together in a more coherent and united way. But of course, it's going to be coordinating. It's not going to be about commanding or, if you like, sort of driving it forward to a set of orders issued from SHAPE, because, of course, there are no authorities for those orders to be driven in that way. So it is, of course, challenging. But I think, to reassure you, I don't think anybody has any disagreement about what we are talking about today. Everybody sees it in the same way. It's a question of who you think the threat really is and where you think, therefore, the emphasis needs to go and what authorities you're prepared to give to SACEUR to enable SACEUR to be able to do this in as coordinated a way as possible.
Thank you.
If I may jump in, we have lots of questions in Q&A from our participants, and there are almost 170, so it will be tough whose question will be chosen. Really very interesting, and I would just like to ask, when preparing for this webinar in the document Integrating Operating Concepts, I really very liked when it mentioned what must we build on, and it says quality of people, alliances and partnership, innovation and experimentation, and values as center of gravity. So in that perspective of values, living in a multipolar world which is characterized by a set of competitive relations or set of competition, let's say, Do you see those values that modern Western democracies are sharing as an important framework to express their national interests of the states, but also to share the interests and to make like those shared interests as common values and you know, something to build, to start to build their relations on?
And the straight answer is yes. I mean, I think, you know, the NATO alliance and the other alliances that we're all part of are essentially underpinned by values and our way of life and the freedom that we espouse associated with all of that. Now, I say that, I think we have to be careful though, because there will be a number of countries who are like-minded, but in the strict definition of the term democracy, probably aren't as democratic as we might want them to be. Mm-hmm. Now, they are nonetheless going to be essential partners in terms of making sure that the other end of the spectrum, totalitarianism, authoritarianism, and everything associated with that doesn't end up becoming the culture and ideology that we end up having imposed upon ourselves. So I think one's got to get the right balance here, and one's got to be careful in the language one uses. And I think that unlike we did in the Cold War, where we essentially created two blocks, mm-hmm. I think for this modern world, it's got to be a world where we think much more about communities of interest. And you start with the interests that you're espousing in, say, technology or the rules of the sea or whatever it might be. And then you build communities that support those interests in order to be able to achieve your outcome. I think if we try and make people make a choice between one block or another, we will very quickly end up with a world that's not the world we want to live in. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, we live in a world that's actually shades of grey. Yeah, it's a simple fact. We've got several questions coming in on the agreement between Australia, UK and US. I guess my first question would be, how do we pronounce it? AUKUS, AUKUS, or whatever it is. But what are the implications? This is a great opportunity so what implications does that have for the NATO community?
Yes, I mean, I think there are a lot of people, a lot of countries reflecting on what it might mean at the moment, whether they sit in the Indo-Pacific region, whether they're part of the Five Eyes, whether they're part of NATO or more broadly. I mean, I think we need to remember that the starting point for AUKUS, as we seem to be calling it, I know it sounds a bit like some quaint bird of prey that might have emerged out of the last millennia, but AUKUS is predominantly about industrial cooperation, and I think that people need to recognise that it's a lot less about a military treaty associated with posture or readiness. It's about cooperation from an industrial perspective, and it's fundamentally about submarines. And I think it's important that people realise that, because I think a lot of people have embellished it into some great new treaty organisation that's going to look like a small version of NATO inside the Indo-Pacific. It's absolutely, that's not the way it's conceived. And I think, you know, there are question marks, of course, about how we all cooperate in industrial terms. And I think that it is not designed to exclude anybody. I think it's about sharing, you know, some sensitive technologies, but fundamentally it's about how we can collaborate together to perhaps produce answers that mean that some of the technologies we need, and in particular submarine capabilities that we need, can be brought into service rather more quickly, and how we can actually achieve greater capability enhancement at a better speed. And I think there's no reason to suppose that others won't be able to be involved in that process as well. So I don't think it's designed at the moment particularly to be exclusive. It's just that those were three countries that could see the opportunity to cooperate together.
I would like to refer to one question, because I also want to like to know your opinion about this. So the question is that we received from Luca Finch says, do you see the future of UK defense strategy as an integrated junior partner alongside the US, or having its own independent model such as France? I wouldn't go so deep into, you know, making it black or white, but really would like to hear more about your vision of US and UK's special relationship that goes from the history and continues today. Do you see that in the future, US will stay the UK's most important strategic ally? Of course, also within NATO, definitely, but I'm talking about these two relations between UK and US.
Yes, I mean, I think if it goes back to the integrated review, which we've referred to 2 or 3 times before, that was published in March, I think the first point to make is that it is very clear in saying at the front end of it that our security as a country is assured through Europe. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. And of course, the NATO alliance is at the heart of all of that. So I think the UK regards its position as being one where it is a major player in NATO, and it sees not necessarily as a senior or junior partner, but a contributing partner to the overall alliance as a whole. Now, of course, it is a fact that we have traditionally been very close in military and intelligence terms to the United States. And there's no change to that relationship. And we share all of the information we have, as we do more broadly in the Five Eyes community. So I don't think there's any change to that either. But I don't think we would necessarily regard ourselves as being a junior partner. I think we would regard ourselves as being a contributing partner. And I suspect that you could see a set of circumstances where the United States is drawn into something towards the east, and perhaps actually what it really needs is a bit of help and leadership within Europe. So I think it's about understanding how the relationship can complement each partner in that relationship. And we should recognise that it is NATO that provides the wrap in which our security is guaranteed.
If I could just follow up then with a question that's come in about the military relationship with the EU. The provisions, of course, on common foreign policy and defence ceased to apply at the beginning of this year. And for some, you can portray this as removing a brake on further EU military integration, but you can also see it as removing the largest single contributor to EU defence capabilities. How do you see the UK's military cooperative relationship with the EU developing?
I mean, the answer is, I think that, we acknowledge that there are going to be a number of common security and military interests that we have with the European Union. And you can see that in the Western Balkans. You can see that, for example, in Mali. So I don't think that our politicians envisage there being no cooperation and no sharing of information. But fundamentally, they believe that it is NATO that provides the best mechanism through which the security of Europe is assured. And I think, to be honest, if you took most European Union military leaders to one side and asked them that question, they would very much agree with that statement. Now, that's not to say that there won't be certain things where it makes sense to collaborate within the European Union, because, of course, if you want to bring some of the other instruments of statecraft to bear, that may well be easier to do in a European Union context than it might be in a NATO context. So I think one needs to have an open mind. But certainly we recognise that we will use NATO first and foremost, but there'll be moments when we're probably operating on the ground in places like Mali where you can see cooperation being a sensible thing to do.
Thank you. There is one interesting question. I will not go into every detail of the question, but it says that there is the mention of cyberspace, or I don't know, cyber warfare is mentioned in this webinar. However, the colleague is missing this economic domain, is missing this look towards the security agenda from the economic perspective. And we know that from the history that global economic crisis usually is leading towards security crisis. So could this happen in your perspective again? And is the world ready to deal with the economic crisis that is evident after COVID-19 pandemic crisis? And also due to lots of regional conflicts that are going at the moment in the world, throughout the world. How do you see this connection between economic and security dimension?
No, well, I mean, I think the premise behind the question is exactly right. I mean, I think that whilst history doesn't repeat itself, it does have a rhythm, and one of the rhythms that fall out of history is that a crisis like COVID can very easily end up in an economic crisis, which could very easily end up in a security crisis. So there's definitely a connection between all of those possible outcomes. And I think, there's some big questions, aren't there, to be asked about whether the institutions that we've created since 1945 onwards are robust and resilient and capable enough to deal with, the demands of the modern world. I think lots of people talk about how the UN and its other institutions should perhaps be reformed to be able to do this. So no, I do. I mean, I think the premise behind the question is right. And I think that one of the biggest questions we have at the moment, of course, is there's so much going on in what is such a complex and dynamic and inherently unstable world, that the bandwidth that our political leadership have got to be able to attend to some of this stuff is limited. It's really a question of how you prioritize all of this. And, it's always interesting, isn't it, to go back and look at people's risk registers during the year 2019 and to question whether or not they were comprehensive enough to have been able to deal with the COVID pandemic that whacked us in 2020. And the answer is they probably weren't in most circumstances. So I think there are some really big questions about how in government and perhaps more broadly outside government that we do think about the connection between all of this. And I do think there's some big questions about whether we're prepared for it, because that requires us to be much better integrated across governments and across partners in international terms to be able to understand it. I think there's some big questions to ask about it.
Thank you. There are lots of questions which are very interesting coming in on how you pursue a career in the military or the Ministry of Defence. But I'm not going to touch those because we'll get back to those with the students directly, I hope, at some other point. But very important questions, and I apologise for not getting to them. We are approaching the end of our time, and so I would just like to go to one theme which is coming up, which will not surprise you, on Afghanistan. And I defy anyone to say that they know more about this than you do, given the experience that you have there. And indeed, one comment, by the way, is from Jack Siegel, who you'll remember from your days in RC South. As the dust settles, and you pointed out international community is involved in all sorts of things. You can't just think about one institution. What sort of lessons do you think, and I would say the international community as a whole, it's not just NATO, are going to end up drawing from their past 20 years of engagement in Afghanistan?
Gosh, how long have we got?
Yeah, sorry.
No, I mean, let me try and pull out two or three things that one might want to think about. I think there's some profound questions to ask about the political guidance that is that you initiate a campaign like that from at the very beginning of it. And I think that, when you look at the way that campaign evolved, there's no doubt about it that, and the old Irish joke, you probably wouldn't have started from where you started from. And I think, being really clear about that is probably the first and biggest lesson. I think the second lesson then is also a question about whether one's got the strategic patience in Western democracies to be able to see that sort of nation building effort through. There's big questions to be asked about how well we understood what we were doing before we started it. And I think our forebears are probably sitting in heaven laughing at us to one degree or another, because I don't think we had a genuine understanding of the local context. And then I think there's some good questions to be asked about how you manage alliances to achieve collective effort and to achieve collective decision making. That's important as well. There are some big questions that I'm sure the Taliban are asking themselves now about how they create inclusive governance. Because the last time Afghanistan probably had inclusive governance was in the late 60s and early 70s. And if they don't quickly find inclusive governance, we'll be into the next phase of fighting in Afghanistan, and the dust will be far from settled, I fear.
Thank you very much. We have approached to the end of this very interesting webinar, unfortunately. Dear General Carter, thank you very much, honestly, for your time and knowledge you shared with us. Thanks to the participants as well who have joined this webinar. As you could see, there was not enough time for all questions to be read. And now at the end of this webinar, I would like to announce our President of the Atlantic Treaty Association, Mr. Jim Townsend, for closing remarks.
Well, thank you all, and General Carter, particularly, thank you for your time. Having been in the Pentagon for many, many years myself, I know what your schedule's like, and we're going to get you out on time to your next meeting. But I'll have to say that you presented over this past hour, both in your presentation and your answers to these questions, probably the most comprehensive and understandable layout of this brilliant thinking coming out of London, both in the government, but particularly in the military side, trying to deal with this world in which we're living in, both from a Paul Mill and from a military perspective. And I thought it was just excellent. And I wish that I don't think enough people in Washington in the governmental side, maybe in the Pentagon somewhat, but I think in Washington at least, we need to hear more of this. And so I would hope that you could come to Washington and have another one of these with a big crowd of the think tankers and the media and the people who shape opinions here in Washington and in the United States, because your layout was certainly understandable. And I think one of the big takeaways for me is how difficult the way is ahead of us to walk down the path that you laid out. I'm thinking in the United States in terms of our own politics, which present its own challenge to us, the lessons that we pulled out of Afghanistan, and I certainly heard the echoes in your last statement. I take that on board. There's a lot of work to do, both here for the United States, but across the alliance, and I think you've laid it out brilliantly. And the first step, of course, is going to be taking this into the strategic concept and then into alliance capitals and having everybody understand this. And your point about having a strategic mindset, having a strategic environment in which to think about this and to begin our work is critical. And my last point before we let you go is really to those who are listening to us now, whether you're in YATA or in the Atlantic Treaty Association itself, whether you're a student who is interested in getting more involved in this, a path you can take is by joining your local ATA chapter. And I will say this is something David Hobbs at the UK ATA is spearheading, because we're having this program today. But it's not just in the UK; it's across the alliance. And I would ask the young people who are listening here, the students or the young professionals, what the general was laying out is for you to implement. It is a torch being passed to you. And the ATA and YATA are certainly vehicles in which we can make this transfer happen. And so I hope as you listen and you wonder about your career and this is piquing your interest, please get in touch with your Atlantic Treaty Association chapter or your YATA chapter, as well as the MOD in London, and take on this mission, which the general and all of us of our generation are handing off to you. And we want to help this transition be a good one. It's going to be a long one. It's going to be a difficult one on the political side and on the military side at home, as well as in Brussels. But we have to go down this road. General, thank you for giving us a map that leads us down this road. And thank you for your leadership. And I invite all those listeners to join us on this journey that we've got to take in this post 9/11 world. So thank you so much. And I wish you all the best in the coming days as you carry forward this task.
No, thank you very much. And curiously, I am coming to Washington in a few weeks' time, and we might be able to set something up. But thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much.
Just let me thank all the participants. I'm seeing some very nice messages come in, thanking you, General, including, by the way, from your Finnish counterpart, the Chief of Defence Staff in Finland. It's so great to see how this type of event is actually reaching across so many communities. We're getting many also votes of thanks from students who have been very stimulated by the whole proceedings. So thank you to everybody who's contributed, and most of all, thank you for your time, General. It's been a great pleasure and privilege. Thank you. I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.